Les amis, aujourd'hui, je vais vous raconter une histoire qui m'a laissé sans voix. Ma voisine est veuve depuis 1 mois et sort déjà avec un homme qui pourrait être son fils. Ne manquez pas cette vidéo, car ce que j'ai découvert sur cette histoire vous choquera autant que moi. Chaque jour sur la chaîne, je vous raconte un nouveau potin ou une nouvelle anecdote que je découvre à travers les fentes de mes rideaux, ici dans le quartier. Et celle d'aujourd'hui est époustouflante. Mais avant de commencer l'histoire d'aujourd'hui, j'aime toujours laisser un message spécial à ceux qui me suivent. Dans le premier commentaire épinglé, j'ai partagé des produits naturels incroyables qui peuvent grandement améliorer votre santé. Je les utilise tous et je les recommande vivement. Ce sont des produits pour divers problèmes, comme l'insomnie, les douleurs articulaires, le diabète, les régimes et bien plus encore. Cliquez simplement sur le lien épinglé dans les commentaires. Vous soutiendrez ainsi la chaîne tout en prenant soin de votre santé. Maintenant, venons-en au fait. J'habite cette maison depuis plus de 15 ans et Margaret a toujours été l'une de mes plus proches voisines. Élégante femme de 55 ans, aux cheveux gris bien coiffés. Elle s'occupait de la maison et du jardin avec un dévouement qui faisait plaisir à voir. Margaret était mariée à Harold depuis plus de 30 ans. Harold était un homme gentil, de quelques années son aîné, et il a travaillé dans une entreprise de construction jusqu'à sa retraite. J'avais toujours observé ce couple par ma fenêtre, non pas par curiosité excessive, bien sûr, mais parce qu'ils étaient ses voisins proches, et j'ai naturellement fini par observer leur routine. Margaret et Harold semblaient avoir un mariage solide. Chaque matin, elle préparait du café et ils le buvaient ensemble sur la véranda. Il entretenait la pelouse le samedi, elle plantait des fleurs le dimanche. C'était une routine harmonieuse que j'observais depuis des années. Mais il y a environ 2 ans, les choses ont commencé à changer radicalement. Harold a commencé à perdre du poids, à vue d'œil. J'ai remarqué qu'il marchait plus lentement et que Margaret l'accompagnait davantage à ses rendez-vous médicaux. Je la voyais l'aider à monter dans la voiture plus souvent. Le jardin, autrefois impeccable sous ses soins, a commencé à paraître négligé. Margaret a également assumé cette responsabilité, mais je sentais bien qu'elle était débordée. Durant les derniers 2 mois de la vie d'Harold, je le voyais rarement. Margaret allait faire les courses seule, recevait la visite de personnes qui lui semblaient familières, et je sentais, au mouvement dans la maison, que quelque chose de très grave se passait. Certains jours, elle refusait même d'ouvrir les rideaux du salon. La maison semblait empreinte d'une atmosphère pesante, même de loin. Harold est décédé il y a exactement 5 semaines. Je l'ai appris grâce à Margaret, qui a déposé une carte de remerciement dans la boîte aux lettres de chaque voisin, annonçant son décès et les remerciant pour leurs prières et leur soutien durant cette épreuve. Les funérailles se sont déroulées dans la plus grande discrétion et, les jours suivants, la maison était remplie de membres de la famille venus soutenir Margaret. J'étais vraiment inquiet pour elle. Perdre un partenaire après plus de 30 ans n'est facile pour personne, et Margaret semblait toujours dépendante de la compagnie de son mari. Pendant la première semaine après les funérailles, je l'ai très peu vue. Juste quelques allers-retours rapides pour l'essentiel, toujours en vêtements sombres, l'air hagard. Mais c'est la 2e semaine que j'ai commencé à remarquer quelque chose de différent. Margaret s'est remise à ranger la maison. Je l'ai vue ouvrir les fenêtres, changer les rideaux et nettoyer le jardin, négligé pendant les derniers mois de la maladie d'Harold. Je me suis dit, c'est super. Margaret essaie de tourner la page. J'ai même trouvé positif qu'elle reprenne ses activités normales. Puis, la 3e semaine, j'ai remarqué une autre voiture garée devant chez elle. Une petite voiture, un de ces modèles récents que les jeunes ont tendance à conduire. Au début, j'ai cru qu'il s'agissait d'un jeune parent, peut-être un neveu ou le fils d'une amie, qui l'aidait à faire des travaux à la maison. Les filles, j'ai failli oublier de vous demander un service. N'oubliez pas d'aimer la vidéo, de vous abonner à la chaîne pour être notifié à chaque nouvelle anecdote et de laisser un commentaire pour me dire ce que vous pensez de cette situation. Et s'il vous plaît, ne quittez pas la vidéo, car la fin de cette histoire a un rebondissement que vous n'auriez jamais imaginé. Mais ensuite, j'ai commencé à faire plus attention. La voiture arrivait toujours tard dans l'après-midi, vers 17h, et restait garée jusqu'à très tard dans la nuit, parfois jusqu'à 22 ou 33 heures. Cela a commencé à piquer ma curiosité. Quel genre d'aide peut bien offrir quelqu'un qui prend autant de temps? C'est un jeudi que j'ai enfin vu qui sortait de cette voiture. Les filles, quand je l'ai vu, j'ai failli tomber de mon siège. Un jeune homme, très jeune, qui semblait avoir une vingtaine d'années. Cheveux noirs et bien coiffés, vêtements décontractés, mais soignés. Il est sorti de la voiture avec une aisance impressionnante, comme s'il était déjà habitué à être là. Et le plus impressionnant, c'est que Margaret lui a ouvert la porte pour l'accueillir avec un sourire. Ce n'était pas le sourire poli que nous adressons aux prestataires de services ou aux connaissances. C'était un sourire chaleureux et accueillant. Elle était soignée, magnifiquement habillée, et je voyais bien qu'elle venait de se faire coiffer. Les gars, j'avoue que j'ai été choquée. Une veuve de moins d'1 mois, accueillant un jeune homme avec une telle familiarité, cela ne me semblait pas normal. J'ai commencé à observer de plus près, et ce que j'ai découvert les jours suivants était encore plus surprenant. Le garçon, dont j'apprendrai plus tard qu'il s'appelait David, commença à venir avec une régularité étonnante. Ce n'était pas seulement 1 ou 2 fois par semaine, c'était pratiquement tous les jours, et toujours à la même heure, toujours jusque tard dans la nuit. Margaret received the flowers with obvious joy. She hugged him. Yes, they hugged. And they chatted at the door for a few minutes before entering. The hug wasn't one of those formal greetings. It was a loving, prolonged embrace, the kind of embrace that occurs between close people. I wondered, was this young man taking advantage of Margaret? Was he interested in some benefit, some inheritance, some financial advantage? Widowed women, especially when they're emotionally vulnerable, can be easy prey for malicious people. I began to observe more closely. David always arrived well-dressed, with his car clean and tidy. He didn't seem to have any financial problems. But then again, what interest did he have in Margaret? The age difference was obvious. She could easily be his mother. Over the weekend, I was even more surprised. David spent all of Saturday at Margaret's house. He arrived in the morning and didn't leave until Sunday afternoon. I saw them together in the garden, she showing him the plants, the two of them chatting animatedly. At one point, I saw them sitting on the porch bench, and Margaret was laughing. Really? This left me deeply confused. On the one hand, I was glad to see Margaret happy again. The deep sadness I had observed in her over the past few weeks seemed to have subsided. She was livelier, more active. But on the other hand, I couldn't help thinking, gosh, her husband died a month ago. Isn't it a bit soon to be considering suitors? Don't look away, because what I discovered will shock you even more. Because this story is just beginning, and what I saw in the following days was enough to leave anyone speechless. The following Monday, David arrived earlier than usual. It was around 3 p.m. when I saw his car pull up. He got out with a large shopping bag. I thought, is he shopping for her now too? Margaret greeted him as always, with that warm smile. But this time, I noticed something else. As they greeted each other at the door, he placed his hand on her waist. Ladies, a hand on your waist. It wasn't a friendly greeting or someone doing her a favor. It was intimacy. I was so shocked, I almost dropped the flower pot I was holding. A widow of little more than a month with a young man placing his hand on her waist. This was beyond what I considered appropriate. I began paying attention to every movement. David stayed late that day, only leaving after 11 p.m. The living room curtains were closed the entire time, but I could see a few lights on and shadows moving across the thin fabric. On Tuesday, he arrived with a small suitcase, one of those weekend bags. My heart sank. Was he spending the night there? It's one thing to have visitors. even frequent ones. It's quite another to have someone stay overnight alone a month after your husband's death, and that's exactly what happened. His car remained parked in front of the house all night. The next morning around 7 o'clock, I saw him leave. He was wearing the same clothes as the day before. It was obvious he had spent the night there. I was in shock. I couldn't believe what I was witnessing. Margaret, a woman I had always respected, who seemed so devoted to her husband, was actually allowing a young man to spend the night in her home, and so soon after being widowed. I began to question whether I really knew Margaret. Could it be that her marriage to Harold wasn't as solid as it seemed? Did she enjoy the freedom to do things she couldn't do while married? Or was David taking advantage of her emotional vulnerability? On Wednesday, I decided to observe more systematically. I positioned my chair to get a better view of Margaret's house and watched her every move. David arrived at his usual time, but this time I paid attention to his behavior. He didn't knock. He had a key. The guy had a key to Margaret's house. He walked in as if it were his own, completely casually. This left me even more perplexed. What kind of relationship allows someone to have a key to the house after only a few weeks of living together? Margaret appeared at the kitchen window shortly after her arrival. She was smiling, moving with an energy I hadn't seen in months. She seemed rejuvenated, more animated. But at the same time, I couldn't help but wonder how inappropriate the whole situation was. That afternoon, I saw them again in the garden. This time, David was helping Margaret prune some plants. They worked together harmoniously, chatting and laughing. At one point, I saw them kiss. Yes, kiss. A quick kiss, but clearly affectionate. I was completely stunned. It was official. Margaret was in a romantic relationship with David. A relationship that was clearly already physically and emotionally intimate. Just a month after her husband's death, I began to wonder what the other neighbors thought. Was I the only one who'd noticed? Had anyone else noticed? I considered telling Mrs. Rose, who lives across the street, but decided to wait a little longer to see what would happen. On Thursday, something interesting happened. David arrived with another person, an older woman, who I guess was about Margaret's age. They greeted each other warmly like old acquaintances. I thought, how interesting. He's introducing Margaret to people close to him. The visitor stayed for about 2 hours. During this time, from the bustle of the house, I could tell they were chatting animatedly in the living room. When the woman left, Margaret escorted her to the door, and they parted with kisses on the cheek and a warm hug. This made me wonder, was David introducing Margaret as his girlfriend to his friends and family? The ease with which it all happened indicated that much, and Margaret seemed completely at ease with the situation, with no sign of embarrassment or hesitation. On Friday, I witnessed something that left me even more confused about the whole situation. David arrived later than usual, around 7 p.m. When he parked, I saw Margaret already waiting for him at the window. She quickly got out and met him at the door. What I saw then shocked me deeply. Margaret was crying. They weren't tears of sadness or despair, but tears that seemed emotional, perhaps of gratitude or relief. David immediately hugged her, comforting her with tender gestures. They hugged for several minutes right there in the doorway, talking in low voices. When they finally entered the house, I wondered what had triggered Margaret's reaction. Had David said something special to her? Had he made some important declaration? Or perhaps she felt guilty about the relationship and he was reassuring her. Over the weekend, things got even more intense. David spent the 2 days at Margaret's house. On Saturday morning, I saw them driving away together. She was dressed to the nines, wearing a beautiful dress I'd never seen her wear before. And he was elegant, wearing a dress shirt. They returned late in the afternoon with several shopping bags. It seemed they had gone shopping together, perhaps even choosing clothes or household items. The intimacy between them was evident. They moved with the ease of a well-established couple. On Sunday, I witnessed something that completely perplexed me. They were in the garden, and Margaret was showing David some photos. I could tell because she was holding what looked like a photo album. David looked at the photos intently, and at several points I saw them laughing together. That intrigued me deeply. What kind of photos was Margaret showing him? Were they family photos? Old photos? Or even photos of Harold? The idea that she could be sharing intimate memories of her marriage to such a young man seemed totally inappropriate. Friends, leave a comment with your thoughts on the ending of this story, because I'm sure you never imagined how this situation would end. And don't forget to click the link in the comments to learn about the natural products I mentioned. They really make a difference in our health and quality of life. The following Monday, I made a decision that perhaps wasn't the best, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to place a chair closer to the window, overlooking Margaret's house, where I could get a better view, and perhaps even hear snatches of conversation. David arrived at his usual time, but this time I was prepared to observe every detail. When he entered the house, I realized Margaret had prepared something special. I could smell a delicious aroma coming from her, probably an elaborate dinner. Around 8 o'clock that evening, they opened the dining room windows. The weather was nice, and they apparently decided to dine with the windows open. It was then that I was able to see, and I admit, hear some fragments of their conversation. What I heard left me even more confused. David called Margaret by her name affectionately, and she responded with the same familiarity. There was no formality between them. It was as if they were a close couple, talking about plans for the future and laughing at private jokes. At one point, I heard David say something about not caring what other people think, and Margaret responded that what matters is how they feel. This conversation made me think they were aware that they might talk about their relationship, but they had decided not to care about what other people thought. On Tuesday, something happened that further heightened my concern. David arrived accompanied by an older man, perhaps Harold's age. The two carried some boxes and entered Margaret's house. I watched for hours, trying to understand what was happening. Was David moving into Margaret's house? Were they planning a more permanent move? The idea horrified me. It's one thing to have a discreet relationship, but it's quite another to practically cohabitate just weeks after becoming a widow. When the older man left around noon, the boxes were still in the house. David and Margaret spent the afternoon organizing. I could see constant movement through the windows. At the end of the day, when David finally left, I realized he hadn't brought any luggage. This confirmed my suspicion. He'd left his belongings at Margaret's house. In fact, they were developing a more serious relationship. On Wednesday, I decided to investigate David a little further. I examined his car more closely and managed to see part of the license plate. I considered discreetly asking a neighbor if anyone knew who the young man was, but I was afraid of seeming too nosy. That afternoon, I saw Margaret and David in the garden again. This time, they were planting new flowers in the flower bed Harold used to tend. Watching Margaret replant her late husband's garden alongside her new partner gave me a strange feeling. It was as if she were symbolically replacing old memories with new experiences. David worked in the garden with obvious expertise. He wasn't someone who helped just out of kindness. He really knew what he was doing. This made me wonder, did he already have gardening experience? Had he learned it from someone in his family? Or perhaps he and Margaret shared this hobby? On Thursday, I witnessed a scene that left me truly concerned for Margaret. It was around 4 p.m. when I heard an elderly woman knocking on her door. From her posture and the way Margaret greeted her, I knew it was a serious conversation. The two women sat in the living room talking for over an hour. Throughout, their body language allowed me to sense, even from a distance, that it was a tense conversation. The visitor gesticulated a lot, and Margaret seemed to be defending herself against some accusation or criticism. When the woman left, Margaret stood in the doorway for several minutes, visibly shaken. She went into the house and closed all the curtains, something she hadn't done in weeks. This told me the conversation had been truly disturbing. David arrived about an hour later. Seeing the closed curtains, he seemed to immediately realize something was wrong. He didn't even ring the doorbell. He used his key and walked right in. A few minutes later, I saw through a small crack in the curtain that David was comforting Margaret. She was crying, and he was holding her tenderly. That scene made me reflect. Regardless of how I felt about their relationship, it was clear that David truly cared for Margaret. On Friday, I finally discovered who had visited Margaret the day before. It was Helen, a woman who attended the same church as Margaret and Harold. Helen is known in the neighborhood for being very religious, and I admit she's somewhat conservative in her views. I ran into Helen at the market and casually asked her if she'd seen Margaret recently. Helen was quick to express her disapproval. According to her, Margaret was disgracing her husband's memory and setting a terrible example for the community. Helen told me she had tried to speak to Margaret as a friend, to alert her to the rumors that were emerging. According to Helen, several people at church were commenting on Margaret's inappropriate behavior, and she felt it was her Christian duty to intervene. That left me wondering. On the one hand, I understood Helen's concern and shared some of her worries. On the other hand, I had noticed that Margaret seemed genuinely happy for the first time in months. Did we have the right to judge how she chose to cope with grief and move forward? Over the weekend, I watched David and Margaret even more closely. They seemed to have gotten over Thursday's episode and were relaxed and happy together again. On Saturday, they invited another couple over for dinner. Young people, probably friends of David's. Watching Margaret interact with people David's age made me realize how rejuvenated she seemed. She laughed easily, actively participated in conversations, and seemed completely at ease in that social setting. On Sunday, they went out together again, but this time they returned with seedlings and gardening materials. They spent the entire afternoon reorganizing the garden, creating new flower beds and planting different species than Harold's usual garden. This symbolized something profound for me. Margaret was literally redesigning her life, creating new patterns and abandoning old routines. It was a complete transformation, and David was clearly an integral part of that process. On Monday of the following week, I made a decision that would completely change my perspective on this situation. I decided I needed to better understand who David was and the true nature of his relationship with Margaret. I started observing his schedule more systematically. David arrived every day between 3 and 5 p.m. and rarely left before 10 p.m. On weekends, he practically lived there. It was definitely more than a casual relationship. On Tuesday, I saw David talking to the mailman in front of Margaret's house. They seemed to know each other well, chatting amiably for several minutes. This told me that David had been around long enough to be recognized by the neighborhood service providers. On Wednesday, something happened that made me question all my suspicions. Margaret and David received a visit from a well-dressed, middle-aged man carrying a briefcase. The meeting lasted about 2 hours, and everyone seemed to be discussing important documents. After the man left, Margaret and David talked for a long time in the garden. The conversation seemed serious but not tense. It was as if they were making important decisions together, planning something significant. It made me wonder, were they formalizing some kind of union? Was David officially becoming a more permanent part of Margaret's life? The speed with which everything was happening continued to amaze me. On Thursday, I finally decided I needed to find out more about David through other means. I started paying attention to details that might give me clues about who he was and where he came from. I noticed that he always parked his car in the same spot, which made it easier to leave. This indicated that he was an organized and considerate person. His clothes were always clean and neat, but not ostentatious. He seemed middle class, working, with no trace of excessive wealth or financial hardship. In the afternoon, I saw him helping Margaret with some household chores. He carried heavy furniture, helped clean the outside windows, and arranged some plants in the garden. This wasn't the behavior of someone simply taking advantage of a vulnerable widow. He was genuinely contributing to the household's livelihood. On Friday, I witnessed a scene that moved me deeply and began to change my perspective on the whole situation. It was late in the day when I saw Margaret and David sitting on the porch bench, talking quietly. At one point, Margaret burst into tears. Not tears of sadness, but tears of intense emotion. David comforted her with genuine patience and affection. He didn't try to stop her crying or minimize her feelings. He simply held her tightly and stayed there, offering silent support. That display of emotional maturity impressed me. For someone so young, David demonstrated a remarkable understanding of how to approach Margaret's grieving process. It was at that moment that I began to seriously question my previous judgments. Perhaps David wasn't a freeloader. Perhaps he truly loved Margaret and was offering her just the emotional support she needed at this difficult time in her life. Over the following weekend, I continued observing Margaret and David, but this time with a less critical and more curious eye. I wanted to truly understand the dynamics of their relationship rather than simply judge them. On Saturday morning, they received a visit from a whole family, a couple with 2 young children. Margaret greeted everyone with obvious joy, affectionately hugging the children and chatting animatedly with the adults. David also interacted naturally with everyone, especially the children, who seemed to appreciate him very much. That scene made me realize that David had strong family ties, and they approved of his relationship with Margaret. He wasn't a lonely or troubled boy. He had a family support network that included Margaret in his social activities. During lunch, which they shared in the garden, I observed how everyone interacted. The children played freely, the adults chatted casually, and Margaret was radiant. She seemed to have found not only a companion, but a new family. On Sunday, something extraordinary happened that would completely change my understanding of the situation. It was a warm afternoon, and Margaret and David were in the garden with the living room windows open. I was watering my plants when I overheard the snatches of a conversation that completely shocked me. David talked about Harold. He mentioned the name of Margaret's late husband with affection and respect. I heard phrases like, "Harold was right when he said," and "he'd be glad to know you're doing well." This intrigued me deeply. How did David know Harold? Had they met before his death? I strained my ears and managed to pick up more details of the conversation. Margaret told David some of her memories of Harold, and David responded with personal knowledge of the situations she described. It was impossible for him to simply pretend to know these stories. The details were too specific. At one point, I heard Margaret say, "Harold always said you were like a son to him." My heart sank. Was David like a son to Harold? How was that possible? Why had I never seen David visiting the house when Harold was alive? The conversation continued, and little by little I began to understand fragments that left me increasingly confused. David spoke of conversations he'd had with Harold, of advice Harold had given him, of promises he'd made to the dying man. That's when I heard the phrase that changed everything. "Harold made me promise to take care of you, Margaret. He knew you couldn't be alone, and he wanted to make sure you were happy." I nearly fell off my chair. Had Harold asked David to look after Margaret? But how? When? And why had I never noticed this connection? Margaret answered in a broken voice, "I know, darling. And I also promised Harold I'd give love another chance, like he always wanted. He said I was too young to spend the rest of my life alone." Those words hit me like a thunderbolt. Had Harold encouraged Margaret to look for someone new? Had he given her his blessing to go ahead? All my moral indignation vanished in the face of this revelation. The conversation continued, and I discovered details that completely reconstructed my understanding of the situation. David wasn't a stranger who had appeared in Margaret's life after Harold's death. He was someone Harold knew and trusted deeply. In the following weeks, I began to notice details I had previously overlooked. I recalled some visits I had witnessed during the last months of Harold's life, but which at the time I interpreted as visits from doctors or distant relatives. Could some of those visits have been from David? Was Harold preparing Margaret for a future without him? Introducing her to someone he trusted to care for her? The following Monday, I made a brave decision. I decided to speak to Margaret directly. I could no longer live with that curiosity taking over. I needed to understand the whole truth about the situation. I waited until David left for work in the morning and then crossed the street to talk to Margaret. When she opened the door, I said simply, "Margaret, I need to talk to you about David. I've been watching both of you, and I confess I'm confused by this whole situation." Margaret looked at me for a moment and then smiled sympathetically. "Ruth, I thought you were curious. Come in. Let's talk. I think it's time you heard the whole story." We sat in Margaret's living room, and she began to tell me a story I never would have imagined. David wasn't just a young man who had appeared in her life after Harold's death. He was, in fact, her informally adopted son. Margaret explained to me that Harold had been David's mentor for over 5 years. David met him through a volunteer program at a hospital where he was being treated for a chronic illness I wasn't aware of. David was a nursing student at the time and was volunteering. The two developed a deep friendship. Harold became a father figure to David, who had lost his father at a young age. Over the next few years, David visited Harold and Margaret regularly, but always at times when I wasn't there, usually on weekend mornings or during the week when I was out shopping. When Harold discovered his condition was terminal, he spoke at length with David about his greatest fear, leaving Margaret alone. Harold knew that Margaret had dedicated her entire life to caring for him, and he worried that she wouldn't know how to rebuild her life after his death. It was then that Harold made David an extraordinary proposal. He asked him to consider approaching Margaret romantically after his death, if she showed interest. Harold believed David to be a person of integrity, caring, and genuinely caring for Margaret. At first, David resisted the idea. The age difference, the circumstances, it all seemed inappropriate. But Harold insisted. He explained that he knew Margaret better than anyone and knew she couldn't be happy alone. He wanted her to have the chance to experience love and companionship again. Margaret told me that Harold had also spoken to her about this. In the final months of her life, he repeatedly encouraged her not to waste her life in eternal mourning and to give love a chance if it presented itself. But he never mentioned David specifically, but he planted the seeds for Margaret to open herself emotionally to a new relationship. When Harold died, David observed a period of appropriate mourning before approaching Margaret romantically. His initial visits were truly supportive and friendly, offering practical help and companionship during her most difficult days. It was Margaret who, a few weeks later, recognized that her feelings for David were evolving beyond friendship. She remembered Harold's words about giving love a chance and decided to be honest about her feelings. David confessed that he had also developed romantic feelings for Margaret over the years of their friendship, but had never acted on them out of respect for Harold and his marriage. When Margaret expressed romantic interest, he finally allowed himself to act on those feelings. Margaret explained to me that their relationship had Harold's full approval. It wasn't a betrayal or a hasty substitution. It was the fulfillment of Harold's explicit wish that Margaret find happiness and love again. Guys, when I heard this whole story, I was speechless. All my outrage, all my suspicions that I'd been taken advantage of or that I was morally incompetent vanished instantly. Harold had not only allowed this relationship, but had actively encouraged and facilitated it. David was not a profiteer, but someone fulfilling a promise made to a dying man. Margaret was not disrespecting her husband's memory, but were honoring his last wish. I left Margaret's house completely transformed by the conversation. I realized how hasty and unfair my judgments had been. I had only observed appearances, unaware of the deep and moving history of their relationship. In the weeks that followed, my perspective on Margaret and David changed completely. Watching them together in the garden, instead of indignation, I felt admiration for their courage in honoring an unconventional, yet genuine and blessed love. David cared for Margaret with impressive dedication. He offered her not only romantic companionship, but also practical support, emotional stability, and a connection to Harold's memories. Thanks to him, Margaret kept an important part of her previous marriage alive, while building a new chapter in her life. I also began to admire Harold in retrospect. What kind of generous and selfless love must a man have for his wife to actively encourage her to find happiness with someone else after his death? Harold had demonstrated extraordinary emotional maturity and generosity. The church community, including Helen, continued to criticize Margaret for a while, but I decided to stop participating in those judgments. Whenever someone commented negatively on the situation, I simply changed the subject or quietly defended Margaret's right to pursue happiness. A few months later, Margaret and David formalized their union in a simple and intimate ceremony. I was one of the few neighbors invited, and it was a truly moving celebration. During the ceremony, David paid a touching tribute to Harold, thanking him for loaning Margaret to him and promising to care for her with the same love and dedication. Margaret was radiant on her wedding day. She seemed to have found a new version of herself, younger, more confident, happier. It wasn't as if she had forgotten Harold or replaced the love she felt for him. It was as if she had expanded her capacity to love and be loved. Today, almost a year after it all began, I see Margaret and David as one of the happiest couples in the neighborhood. They work together in the garden, receive frequent visitors, and have built a harmonious and loving life. This experience taught me a valuable lesson. Don't judge other people's situations without knowing the whole story. What seemed like a scandalous and inappropriate situation was, in reality, one of the most beautiful and moving love story I've ever witnessed. Margaret and David showed me that love can take unconventional forms, but that doesn't make it any less valid or pure. They taught me that sometimes the greatest demonstrations of love involve sacrifice, generosity, and the courage to go beyond traditional, societal expectations. What did you think of this story? Can you imagine Harold's courage in encouraging his wife to find new love? Or Margaret's courage in opening her heart so soon after losing her longtime husband? Tell us in the comments what you think about this situation. Do you think love can transcend social conventions when it's genuine and well-intentioned? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive notifications every time I share a new story about what I see in my neighborhood. Like the video if you enjoyed this story, and share it with your friends who also enjoy a good gossip with a surprising ending. Oh, and once again, don't forget to click the link in the first comment to check out those natural products I always recommend. They're products that really make a difference in our health and well-being, and you'll also be helping the channel. Until next time, ladies. And remember, sometimes things aren't exactly what they seem at first glance. It's always worth knowing the whole story before judging.